Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing another Osamu Tezuka manga. At this point you guys must be like, when are you going to finish with those Osamu Tezuka reviews? And the answer to that is probably never. The manga I'll be reviewing today is Clockwork Apple, which has nothing to do with Clockwork Orange, but there is actually an interesting story of Osamu Tezuka to do with Clockwork Orange that is presented in here. Basically, this is a short story collection, and these short stories were spread out across a couple of Seinen manga magazines. So this is actually a Seinen short story collection from Osamu Tezuka, which I was thinking to myself, hot damn, that sounds amazing. So, you know, I had a huge amount of expectation looking forward to it. So, what did I think of it? Was I satisfied? Well, we'll find out in this review. Let's start out with the premises of the story. So basically, because this is a short story collection, I can't do my usual thing where, you know, I give the summary of the story. So let's start out with the actual premises. So there are 8 stories in this that were published between 1968 to 1973. And in general, they're sci-fi. I'd say at least 6 of them are definitively sci-fi. You know, where they're either full-on sci-fi with robots and spaceships, or they have sci-fi elements. So they might have, for example, a type of drug that causes people to act unusual. Or they might have the very kind of odd supernatural element to do with something that isn't quite real or living or etc, etc. You know, those kind of things. The other 2 stories, one of them might possibly have a sci-fi element in it. Even if it does, it's not really that, you know, direct, so I wouldn't really class it as a sci-fi story. And then the other one has no element of sci-fi in it at all. So, in general, it is sci-fi. But even so, there's actually a decent variety in premises. So a couple of the stories are set in the far future or near future. One of them is actually set right after World War II, which is quite interesting. And a couple of them are set in present day. Now when I say present day, I mean like quote-unquote present day. I mean 1968 to 1973. Present when it was published, I should say. But there's a decent variety of premises. Now, what did I think of the stories themselves? In general, I found them entertaining and interesting, but one thing that was very consistent about the stories was that I was quite disappointed with their endings in general. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take the titular Clockwork Apple. So, the story with Clockwork Apple, I won't give any spoilers because it's a short story, but basically the premise of it is that there's this man, and he starts to realize that things aren't quite what they seem, that there's a conspiracy going on. And at first, you know, I was really hooked into the story. I was thinking, God, this, you know, like, what is happening here? You know, who are these people? How are they related to him? Or to the town that he lives in? You know, what is going on? And I was coming up with all these, like, you know, theories in my head. I was reading through it. Each time I was presented with a new clue or bit of information. But once I got to the end of the story, I was quite disappointed in that it wrapped up very neatly. There was a major, you know, kind of a Deus Ex Machina at the end that kind of solved everything out of nowhere. And also, like, what was actually happening just wasn't as interesting as the theories I was coming up with in my head. So I found that quite disappointing. And in many of the stories, they are kind of disappointing at the end, where it just kind of ends, you know, out of nowhere, or it kind of just goes on a little too long or a little too short. In general, I just found their endings very unsatisfactory, which is a shame because quite a lot of these stories I was really interested in all the way up to their endings. Now, that's not to say that I enjoyed every story. The second story, which has to do with a female android, I just didn't really get the point of, and therefore I couldn't really get into it. Whereas one of my favourites, actually, and I was quite satisfied by its ending, was the 7th story, which had to do with a revolutionary and was set in the near future of Japan. I thought that was a really interesting and intriguing story overall. It had a nice little twist at the end as well. So, in general, stories, you know, in general they are interesting and engaging, but I just wish that the stories themselves had wrapped up better. Now, in regards to the art, this was published between 1968 to 1973, and as you can imagine, there is a slight variation in quality of the art. Not to mention the fact that this was around the time when Osamu Tezuka was starting to get into making seinen manga, so he was kind of experimenting with the more realistic art style. Now, in general, his art is very nice in this manga. In fact, I would say that the highlight story in terms of art is actually a Night on the Bypass, which I really adored because it had these very sharp, clear lines and nice kind of geometric heads. If I can show you an example of that. Oh, and some nice lighting and shading as well. Like, for example, that. I mean, just look at the shading there and like the very sharp line work. I just found the story very satisfying from an artistic perspective, which is interesting then because once I moved on to the next story, I found out less satisfying artistically, simply because if you take a look, it's a little more blurry, it's a little kind of more, less sharp line work, a bit more like smudgy, just not as satisfying artistically. But in general, I'm very satisfied with like the level of detail, you know, the level of realism. Obviously, it isn't as realistic as a lot of other seinen manga, because Osamu Tezuka was moving from his cartoony style to the more realistic art style. But even so, there's a very nice level of detail, a very appealing art style, and some very nice panel work as well. Perhaps one of the highlights of the panel work being, for example, there. Some very nice dynamism right there. Overall, very satisfying artistically. No color pages or anything, I should point out. It's just full-on black and white as normal. From digital manga themselves, the treatment of this release, in general, it's very similar to a lot of their other Osamu Tezuka releases. First of all, if I get my trusty Yatsuba to show you the trim size is the same as pretty much all of their other Osamu Tezuka releases. So as you can see, a little bigger than normal tankobon size, and that does allow some of the stories to breathe in terms of art. Although, for example, that story I mentioned, it also allows some of the defects to show as well, which is quite unsatisfying. The paper quality is pretty much the same as Alabaster, you know, just that nice higher quality paper than their previous releases from like Triton or Captain Ken. So very nice levels of whites and blacks, and also very smooth on the fingertips, very satisfying paper overall. Now, in terms of page numbers, this is something I pointed out with my review of Brave Dan. They still had the contents page showing the numbers, but oddly enough, they seem to have pretty much abandoned actually having page numbers in the story. Oddly enough, though, there's a single page in the story that actually does have a page number there, as you can see, 87. But that is the only one that actually has a page number. Every other page does not indicate which page it is, which I'm kind of confused as to why that is. Like, why has digital manga stopped putting page numbers in? It makes it much less easier to actually be able to navigate through the book. Of course, if you're reading it straight through, that's no problem. But if you're looking for a specific story, you can't just simply open up the page easily. You just need to be able to keep working through until you actually find that story. So, a little awkward there. I don't know what the deal is there. They have the afterword that Osamu Tezuka did, which, you know, is the standard thing that they're doing now from the Osamu Tezukas. I usually enjoy them a lot, but besides the story of how Osamu Tezuka got the title, I found this afterword quite unsatisfying, mainly because he ends up talking about another manga called Fire Mountain, which, you know, I have never read. Maybe it'll work in the original release, because maybe this was released after Fire Mountain, so maybe people who were reading this knew about what he was talking about. But unfortunately for me, I did not know anything about Fire Mountain, and while the information he gives is quite interesting, it has nothing to do with this release. So from that perspective, I found the afterword quite disappointing. And also, as general, digital manga are including when the stories were originally released. So they give the date on when it appeared, which magazine it appeared, etc., etc., which is very nice. I really like that little feature. So, in general, I'm very happy with the way that digital manga presented this. I do wonder about the page numbers, like what the deal is with those. But what can you do? So overall, Clockwork Apple, what did I think of it? In general, I enjoyed reading it. I did find a lot of the stories dissatisfying in their conclusion, but the actual stories themselves in general, I did find quite interesting. Interesting ideas, interesting premises, etc., etc. There was one story that really didn't do anything for me, one story that really satisfied me. In general, stories kind of just satisfied me. I wasn't too enthused with them, but I found them interesting anyway. The art, very satisfactory, and, you know, happy with digital manga's release. Now, it is worth noting that the only way to get this currently is from Akadot. physically. Digitally, I believe you can get it from Manga. But what I would recommend is if you're interested in this, maybe wait until the next Osamu Tezuka Kickstarter and see if this is an option to add in. It's generally cheaper there. But if you can't wait, Akado's the way to go. Overall, I'd recommend this to people who are Tezuka fans, of course, and to those who are looking for unusual adult stories. If you're looking for very satisfying stories, or stories that have like very clear themes, then this might not necessarily be the work for you. You might want to start Osamu Tezuka somewhere else. I would certainly not recommend this as a first Osamu Tezuka read. This is something that you really want to see for his style, and the style of the author himself. You'd want to be familiar with his works, I should say. So anyway, that's my Clockwork Apple review. Hopefully you found that enjoyable, entertaining, and informative. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.